Good evening and welcome to this new program in which we'll be looking at recent paperbacks. Now, in the last 2 years, Penguin have published 9 of the works of Vladimir Nabokov in paperback. Lolita, of course, was one of the first. The latest is Tyrants Destroyed and Other Stories, and last month there appeared The Gift. Martin Amis.
The Gift was written in Berlin during the 30s. This was the first stage in an exile that had forced Nabokov out of Russia and would lead him on to France before he found a second home in the United States. In Berlin, Nabokov was a minor star in the enclosed world of emigre intellectuals, eking out his income by giving lessons in a typically Nabokovian variety of subjects: languages, tennis, boxing, and lepidoptery. The Gift was his last Russian novel. Readers who know Nabokov only through Lolita would probably be happier with other novels from Nabokov's Berlin period, novels that were written earlier but translated later and by Nabokov himself. I mean, Laughter in the Dark, Despair, and King, Queen, Knave. This is the vein in Nabokov that I myself value most. The writing is very fast, callous, disdainfully witty, reminding you that Nabokov is, apart from anything else, one of the funniest writers of the century. And in these books we see, too, his talent for investing the most ordinary landscapes with weird and furtive life. But these are English novels in a sense that The Gift simply is not. The Gift is Russian to the spine. On its opaque but glittering surface, the novel concerns a young writer, Fyodor, a displaced Russian living the kind of life in Berlin that Nabokov knew pretty well. Giving language lessons to a series of depressing Berliners, Fyodor dreams of his literary past and his literary future, and develops a love affair with his landlord's stepdaughter, Zina. But as Nabokov points out in his introduction, the heroine of the novel is not Zina, it is Russian literature. Pushkin and Gogol are more real to Fyodor than the misty phantoms who flow through Berlin. In this sense, the novel has more pattern than plot. It is a meditation on literary heritage, the writer setting his own genius against the genius of his cultural past. There are, of course, many passages of great elegance and dazzle, as when Fyodor notices that the street he lives on begins with a post office and ends with a church, like an epistolary novel. But most readers will find The Gift a bit too exotic, a bit too fancy. It is Silver Age work, and silver of the bauble, perhaps, not of the knife.
Would you give an example of Nabokov of using the silver of the knife?
Well, in those 3 early novels I mentioned, he tends to write about a much darker side of life than, say, in The Gift. The Gift is a rather hearty book about the artistic life. It's a terribly brisk, sort of healthy book. Laughter in the Dark, Despair, King, Queen, Knave are about lies, adultery, murder, and they bring out a natural playful cruelty in Nabokov, which speaks much more directly to me and to most of us than his playing with literary tradition.
Yes, I think even in this book, in The Gift, you're quite right in saying he's more interested in the literary tradition, the sort of literary heritage and all that, and that literature is really the heroine. But in fact, it's the other part, the ordinary, everyday observation, particularly very acute visual observation of the life of the emigres in Berlin, the writing.
Yes.
That does bring life to you in much, don't you think, the sort of way of the great Russian writers of the 19th century?
Indeed, this is true, and it's an occupational hazard of extremely clever writers who, in some sense, too clever to be novelists. I mean, Nabokov is a great novelist, that's not in question, but he loves to go off and digress, rather as Saul Bellow does. And you're constantly longing for him to get back to the recognizable world, because he writes about it so illuminating.
Well, there's one whole chapter in this book that's a complete digression. It might be almost a section of another book that he's just thrown in.
This is Fyodor's book about Chernyshevsky,
exactly.
Which reads like some thesis that Nabokov crammed into the novel in its second draft.
But it's odd that a writer who is so sensitive as a writer in his observation of human feeling and human behavior should do such clumsy things.
Well, I think he could justify it in terms of the book's patterning. And it's not something we're used to looking for in a book. We tend to look for plot and events.
Yes, but if the book's patterning stops you reading the book, it's not very successful, is it?
That's the point.
What do you think of this, Declan?
Well, one thing that amazed me, and I had to reread the introduction twice over to make sure I got it, was the fact that it was translated. You say that it's sort of typically Russian compared to the others, but I'll tell you what I meant by this. the whole language is so English somehow as it comes through. It was translated by his son, I think. Is that
Most
true?
of it was translated. No, first chapter by his son, the other by Michael Scammell.
And then the whole April Fool's joke, that dreadful thing at the very beginning, you know, it's such an English sort of joke. I didn't realise, in fact, you know, that
Shall we
April...
explain that? There's simply, you
Well-
mean
well,
where
here's what
he's written his
happens.
book of poems and...
The poet has written his book, and somebody rings up, a friend, and says, you've got the most incredible review. Well, to anyone who's ever written a book, to hear the words of that review, which the friend reads out, you see, would be absolutely, it makes your day. So he goes around dancing, and then we hear the whole poems that he sort of rethinks in terms of this wonderful review that
He's
got.
imagining the words of that
Yes.
review. Yes.
And then he's thinking, now, who wrote it? And he's thinking through various possible people, you know. I can so feel for him. Until he gets to the friend's house, and the friend simply hands him a German paper, to the surprise of the poet, who thought it was going to be Russian, until he sees that it's got April 1st as the date on it. So it's an April Fool's joke, the whole review. And then it sort of says he was choking up during the evening. Well, to me that would be an English joke.
Could also
I
be a-
had no idea that foreigners observed April Fools.
No, that not, but it could be a sort of Chekhov short story, actually, don't you think?
A brutal
Terrible.
Russian joke.
It could be
Well,
just
they're
a
awful.
brutal Russian joke. Could we just say something about Lolita? I mean, Lolita is the book everybody's read of Nabokov, or most people. Do you think it's slightly suffered by its sensational content of the middle-aged man in love with an infant, and people have missed the excellent, marvellous writing there is peripheral to that?
Well, I think coincidentally it is his best book. The trouble is that because of the sensationalism, people tend to read it when they're too young to appreciate it. And in fact, they usually stop after the seduction of Lolita and think, oh, well, that's the end of that. And don't read the second half of the book, which is in fact better, or even better than the first. But I think everyone tends to read books when they're too young for them, and or to go back to them and then be led on from there into the other delights of Nabokov.
Do you think he is a popular writer, or is he really a writer's writer?
He is a highbrow writer. There's no question about that. But he writes. His books are accessible on several levels, so you can read in what he would think of as a very unsophisticated way, i.e., identifying with the characters, enjoying the jokes. And there's a lot of patterning and literary foolery going on that you needn't be aware of.
But it is fairly hard work making the gift enjoyable on an ordinary level, don't you think?
I'd have thought so.
And a pity, too, because where it is enjoyable on an ordinary level, it's as good as the good parts of Lolita, almost. They're very different in background.
Indeed.
Thank you all very much indeed. Well, we'll be back about the same time next week, when our guests are going to be Quentin Crisp, who is the author of The Naked Civil Servant, the biographer, Michael Holroyd, and Auburn Wall. Good night.